Obamacare ruling. And we'll move on also and talk about politics, and particularly in my home state of Georgia. Joining me right now is Democratic strategist Joe Lestingi. Joe, it's great to have you with us.
Pleasure to be here.
All right, so we know there's this primary taking place right now on the Republican side, but the Democratic candidate, I should say, Michelle Nunn, has already been identified. Is she, to you, one of the most exciting Democrats running for a Senate seat this time around?
Well, that's a lofty title to put on anyone running. I mean, there are a lot of exciting candidates on the Democratic side. I think she's got a great background and a great history here, especially given who she could possibly be up against after today's primary. I mean, she's bipartisan work in her history. She worked with H.W. Bush during his time through his organization. She's worked across the aisle, and her family has a rich tradition in Georgia. I'm actually glad to hear you're from Georgia, because so am I.
Oh, well, fellow Peach Stater, great to have you. Are you a Tech fan or a Bulldog fan?
I am a Georgia grad, my friend. Go Dogs.
Go Dogs. All right, no offense to Tech fans, but you know the record. 12 years in a row now, I think. Anyway, let's talk about more important matters, maybe, to some anyway. And we have Matt Towery joining us, who is also a Georgia grad. Matt, great to see you.
Good to see you.
All right, so we were talking about Michelle Nunn. We'll back up real quickly and talk about the task at hand. Joe, we'll be back with you in a second. Of course, today is Tuesday in Georgia, the GOP primary runoff. And what's been most interesting to me, Matt, about this race is what came out last week about David Perdue and this meeting he had with the Chamber of Commerce, where he apparently said, I'm not going to take this from the Chamber of Commerce. I don't need you guys. I'm getting the heck out of here.
Well, you know, John, we've been polling this race for the last many, many months. And I have to be honest with you, there's been much ado about the Chamber of Commerce everywhere but here in Georgia. The voters aren't focused on the Chamber of Commerce. The Perdue campaign decided to run an ad attacking the Chamber of Commerce going into this weekend. The Chamber decided they would run an ad defending themselves. The voters aren't paying any attention to that issue. They're really paying attention just to the general negative ads that two candidates run against each other and the positive ads that they run. I think that the Perdue campaign got a little obsessed with the Chamber of Commerce, and in the end, that may have cost them the possibility of getting the nomination, according to where the polls show the race to be right now.
Yeah, maybe some reaction to what happened with Dave Brat in Virginia and the issue of immigration here, and still not really clear on how that is going to break in 2014. Matt, another question on this race. We do want to play, we talked about campaign ads. Let's play a Perdue spot here. He's, of course, branding himself as an outsider, a man who came from humble beginnings. Let's take a listen to Perdue's spot.
Long before he led the Reebok turnaround, long before he turned around Dollar General, and yes, long before David Perdue would run some of America's largest companies, he just helped his family grow watermelons in Middle Georgia.
Somewhat different than what we saw play out in Mississippi. Perdue is an outsider, but he's not the Tea Party guy because, of course, Jack Kingston is getting a lot of the Tea Party support in this race. So, Matt, how is Perdue's role as an outsider playing in these ads with Georgia voters?
Well, it's interesting, John. You got it on the nail there. In fact, we see in this race in Georgia not a Tea Party race. It never really has been a Tea Party race. It's been more of an outsider versus insider race. The outsider has played very well in the metro Atlanta area, particularly with and the northern parts of the state, and particularly now with women. Perdue's doing better with women in this runoff. But in reality, the insider side with Jack Kingston hasn't hurt him very much at all. He managed to pick up a lot of the support that the other candidates he was running against, who were also insiders, they've all held office at one time or another, received. So it really is pretty much a wash in terms of outsider versus insider in terms of this particular race.
Now, another ad in this race, and Joe, thanks for sticking in. We'll get to Michelle Nunn in just a second real quick. But another ad that came out, I think it was a flyer, Matt, maybe you've seen this, came from the Kingston camp accusing Perdue of doing business with French bankers who support terrorists. Of course, we're talking about the PNB probe. Some French bankers got in trouble for their ties to terrorism here. Is this working? Is this type of attack ad? Or is this also telling us perhaps that maybe Kingston thinks this race is closer than the pollsters believe it to be?
Well, these ads got to be sort of silly towards the end. And rather than reaching out through robocalls using Karen Handel or Phil Gingrey or other people who he had run against who now support him, they turned to these ads to try to basically collect just thousands of votes by spending hundreds of thousands of dollars. I don't think either ad, really, the Perdue one which you just played or this ad, had really much of an effect on this race. This is all about turning out the vote that you already received. The undecided was down to 13% by the time these ads were cut. we're going to be down to very few votes deciding this race today, but these television ads have pretty much, except for the one which some might have seen, in which they show Perdue sort of as a mannequin and they're rolling him through Georgia. That was a pretty clever ad. Ran too late, though, and never had a chance to take hold with the public. It still looks like Kingston's leading, but by a small margin.
Very interesting. I'll do some exit polling later with my mom and my dad, and we'll check back in here later on what happens today. Now, let's go ahead over to you, Joe. And as this race plays out here, this runoff, which of these two candidates would you rather face if you were advising Michelle Nunn?
Well, I would love to be advising Michelle Nunn. Unfortunately, I'm not. But I will say this. I think either candidate offers a really good contrast for us. This primary, and I hate to say this, I hate to see divisive primaries that are as visceral as this. And in Georgia, we don't see this that often, especially on the Republican side. But this thing has gotten really ugly, and it's laid a lot of landmines out there for both candidates.
I would imagine you're going to hop on those landmines and use them to your advantage, or the Democrats will, I should say, as they continue to talk about it.
I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll let them hop on the landmines.
Right, maybe a better visual there.
Out there for us. But, Michelle Nunn has a great background here. She's got private sector and nonprofit history that's going to contrast well against Kingston's insider play, like we discussed. And Perdue's made some comments here that appear to be alienating some of the key groups. I mean, the chamber, even though most voters don't pay attention to the chamber does bring a lot of resources to the table for Republicans to communicate their message. So it sounds like if Perdue gets the nomination, they may not be too happy with him, and they may either sit out or consider Michelle's candidacy.
Well, they have backed him. The chamber has backed Perdue pretty strongly, even though that he's stepped aside from their line on the immigration issue. But let's talk about Michelle Nunn a little more. Of course, she's running on her father's name, the former Senator Sam Nunn, very popular still in that state. But he is what I would call a dino. We talk about rhinos a lot, but he's a dino. A Democrat, perhaps, maybe in name only, very socially conservative, a foreign policy hawk as well, and also often talked a lot about the deficit when he was serving in Washington. Is Michelle Nunn, does the apple fall far from the tree?
Well, I think it's very nice to hear that term reference to Democrats in the past, because the party has evolved a bit since the time Senator Nunn was in office. And I think that shows more about the party's dynamics and willingness to accept change moving forward. But that being said, Michelle encapsulates the good qualities that her father probably taught her when she was young, and some of the new progressive qualities that Democrats have in the new Democratic Party. This is a big thing in Georgia. Pedigree is a big deal when it comes to family names, because a lot of people really liked her father. She is her own woman, though, and that's the beauty of this race. She's going to run on her stances and on her history, and I think that's going to bode very, very well for her when November rolls around.
All right, Matt, do you think that's going to work, though? Because if she does face off, let's say, against Kingston here, he does represent the city of Savannah, but he also has his name rings out through that entire I-16 corridor from Savannah through Macon all the way up into Atlanta. There's one way to get there anyway. He's been around for a long time. He has his own pedigree. He's been serving that district for a very long time. He still would be, I think he would match up better against Nunn, no?
Well, let me first of all start with this. As a pollster, I can empirically tell you pedigree really doesn't matter that much in Georgia anymore, because most people who vote aren't from Georgia.
Excellent point.
And most people in the polling that we did early on didn't even remember Senator Sam Nunn. You got to remember, he left office in the early or mid-1990s, rather. And they also, I might add, the stance he took against Desert Storm wasn't very popular. That's one of the reasons why he didn't run for re-election. That said, she is still leading the two potential Republican nominees by 7 or 8 points, because she is an unknown entity. And I think that's a positive thing for her. The fact that they don't know who she is, she can inform and let people know exactly what they want, what the Nunn campaign wants them to know about Nunn. It's going to be a very tight race, but name ID will be won by television ads, and both of these candidates will have plenty of money to make sure they have saturated name ID. All
right, Matt, I want to follow up there quickly, and Joe, get your response also. But as voters start to introduce themselves and learn more about Michelle Nunn, is that number going to change, Matt, that differential you just talked about? Because, from what I've seen, she's not the most charismatic candidate.
Well, listen, I know it seems like we have vitriolic primaries down here, but Georgia's had a lot of nasty primaries over the years. This isn't anything really new. And if you haven't seen nasty, you haven't seen nasty at all until you see this general election, because the Republicans and certainly the third-party groups that will be aiming at Nunn, they will attack her on all sorts of statements she's made. We know how this all goes. And certainly if it's Kingston is a nominee, they'll go after the record. If it's Perdue, they'll go after what he said as well. Either way, it's going to be tough sledding for all of these candidates. By the way, I predict this race will ultimately end up in a
Oh, we had Matt. I think he was saying, I don't know, runoff there. We'll see.
Interesting.
All right, we'll get an update from Matt on what he said there. Joe, real quickly, with about 45 seconds left to go, the best quality, the most marketable quality you think Michelle Nunn brings to this campaign?
It's going to be her background, and it's because it contrasts so well against both of those potential candidates. And not only that, one good quality, and I think it's time that Georgia finally did this and sent a woman to the U.S. Senate, is that she is going to appeal, especially in Cobb and Gwinnett counties, to the female voters in those areas. And those are the swing districts around the state. Savannah is a good market, but this is going to be won and lost in the Atlanta suburbs. And I think that she's going to go in there with a good message. And the Republicans have been beating each other up for so long. Some of those negatives may be baked in, and they may not just be happy with those candidates. So Michelle's got a huge window of opportunity, and I think she's going to do a great job here.
All right, time will tell. Matt Towery, real quickly, with about 15 seconds to go before you got frozen there. You said you predicted this race will end how?
I believe it will end up in a general election runoff. I don't think either the Republican or the Democrat will get the 50% plus one vote you have to get to win a race straight out in November.
Good stuff, Matt Towery, Joe Lestingi. Thanks so much for being with us. We're back with more here on America's Forum.